Ever since the 1980s, racists like Ronald Reagan came up with racial code words like welfare queens and food stamp fraud. Now, we all know that whites make up the vast majority of food stamp recipients, and yet, whenever the white media would discuss people defrauding public assistance programs, they always showed only black people. And usually it was some single mother who managed to get a few extra bucks to buy herself some designer clothing or some other vanity purchase. That or Pookie, the neighborhood tough guy, would be trading food stamps for cash. Petty crimes elevated to astronomical levels by a white media that was desperate to push a racial narrative. They would tell the public that food stamp fraud cost the taxpayers hundreds of millions a year, yet they never told the public where the majority of food stamp fraud comes from, or how real food stamp fraud actually works, because the handful of two-bit grifters in the hood are not responsible for even a tenth of food stamp fraud in the United States. That would be the white community. The media knows this, the politicians know it too, but they get their power from catering to the white majority in America, so they don't dare tell them the truth. That the piddling few dollars LaQuisha the hood rat managed to skim for herself was chump change compared to what her white counterparts were stealing, because as I and others have always said, if you want to find out who the vast majority of food stamp frauds are, you have to look at the businesses, because they're the ones who actually redeem the food stamps with the government in the first place. They're also the ones in the best position to carry out the most widespread food stamp fraud and get away with it, since they usually represent the political donor class, who the politicians are extremely reluctant to prosecute. We'll cover that in a moment. And so they are able to cover up their crimes much better than a single mother on welfare. So, let's get right to exposing the real food stamp fraud the white media doesn't want you to see. All these cases I'm going to cover are from the last 18 months alone. Rushden, New York, February of last year. Police arrested more than 30 people, all white, in what was the largest food stamp fraud case at that time. The place where all this white food stamp fraud took place was called the Butcher Block Store. The owner of the store was the one orchestrating this fraud. People would buy alcohol, among other items that the food stamp recipients were not allowed to buy, and would be given cash in return, usually at 50 cents on the dollar. And according to authorities, this was the second time they'd caught the owner doing this. A black man, if merely accused of fraud, goes to prison right away with the very first accusation. White males, on the other hand, get caught committing fraud and nothing happens to them. Next time some Stormfront troll tries to cut and paste their phony baloney stats about blacks commit all the crimes, just keep in mind, it's not who commits the crimes that counts, it's who counts the crimes. In the U.S., white males commit most of the crime, but they have legal immunity from the law, too. I hope you've been paying close attention to the faces I've been showing you. Ordinarily, I wouldn't take my time showing you all their faces one by one, but I'm trying to make a point. Although whites are the vast majority of food stamp recipients in the United States, just as whites make up the majority of murderers and the majority of food stamp fraudsters, these stories simply don't get covered. Coverage, by the way, doesn't mean to merely report a story. Coverage means to continue to follow a story, to stay on it day after day. You don't cover something by merely glancing at it and moving on. You cover it by looking at it and continuing to look at it. Know the difference. Now, you know why they spend so much time trying to push this myth about black food stamp recipients ripping off the system. When you control all the money, all the resources, all the jobs, the government and media, and yet you still are the majority of people who need public assistance, that means you failed. How can whites believe they're superior to blacks when this is the sad reality? Well, they do it by not looking at it. And instead they manufacture a make-believe epidemic of black public assistant fraud and make that the biggest story on earth. If we had a real media instead of a white supremacist propaganda mill, people would already know all this. But then again, the purpose of the media is to maintain the current social order, not to indict the white majority. And that's why, even with over 30 people arrested, white media didn't dare give this wall-to-wall coverage. Compare that to the ridiculous spectacle those same New York law enforcement authorities and white media gave to the obscenely exaggerated, huge drug bust in New York this year called Operation Smackdown. 77 people arrested, and all the cops got was $44,000 in cash, 18 guns, and 1 pound of cocaine. But the way the white media and the police reported it, you would have thought they caught Osama bin Laden and half of ISIS with a couple of nuclear warheads. This is how the media manipulates the public and manufactures the narrative of the big bad black man. They look all over town for a black lawbreaker, and only a black one. They operate with a daily quota. Doesn't matter if it's murder, theft, or jaywalking. If the person arrested is black, they will be the lead story on the local news. And if they can't find a black person locally, then they look in the next town, throughout the county, the next county over, hell, the next state. And if they can't find any more black arrestees to lead the news, then they simply repeat the same story from yesterday or the day before or the week before until a new black person gets arrested. This is the media template, done for the sake of social engineering. But when the criminals are white, they are almost never covered, and on the few occasions they are, it's usually a one-and-done story. No propaganda value. Now, the brushed-in white food stamp fraud ring could have been a one-off. Except it wasn't, because in Fairfield, Ohio, the police busted another big white food stamp fraud operation, and this one was also operating out of what appeared to be a legitimate business. The bust involved dozens of federal and state law enforcement officials, and yet out of all the news agencies in the area, only one TV station bothered to show up.
Only 9 on your side was here in Fairfield and in Mount Healthy today as federal, state, and local law enforcers fanned out to make more than 13 arrests. You can see how big the operation here is. U.S. Beef in Fairfield. We're not going too tight because there are a lot of undercover police officers doing the work next to that company there. More than 50 law enforcers from the U.S. Agricultural Inspector General's Office, Secret Service, Ohio Investigative Unit, Butler County Sheriff's Office participated. A SWAT team was standing by but was not needed. Just released tonight on your side is this undercover video that investigators say shows truck drivers for U.S. Beef trafficking in food stamp cards, or what's commonly referred to as EBT cards, or electronic benefit transfer cards. Now the total fraud here, $2 million. By means of comparison, the total fraud for the state of Ohio just last year was $5.3 million. So about 40% of that was from right here, at least the agents say, in this company in Fairfield.
You heard that right. According to the authorities, this one white food stamp fraud ring alone was responsible for 40% of the food stamp fraud in the entire state of Ohio. Kinda puts the whole white supremacist meme about blacks commit all the crimes in proper context, doesn't it? And yet this story was treated as a minor local matter. Do you think if a group of black people had been accused of being responsible for 40% of any particular crime in the state, it would be a one-and-done story? The police did eventually put out photos of the business owners of U.S. Beef, but the pictures are in black and white, and of such poor quality they're virtually unidentifiable. And in almost none of the online stories that I've found do you see photos of those arrested. Over a dozen people busted for the biggest public assistance fraud in the state, and their pictures are harder to find than a white supremacist brain. The media are not neutral observers in all this. They are the propaganda arm of white supremacy. Sure, they'll do a couple of cover-our-asses stories here and there, so no one can accuse them of having never covered the truth. But for the other 364 and a half days a year, it will be the same old race baiting against black people. Now, so far I've been throwing around terms like white supremacist and food stamp fraud as though the two were synonymous, and you could be forgiven for criticizing me for false association. However, the next case of white food stamp fraud, this one from just 4 months ago, proves that there's nothing false about it. You've probably heard of the Church of Latter-day Saints. The Mormons are well-established white supremacist lunatics with more wacky beliefs than the Scientologists. one of the LDS's members, named Warren Jeffs, decided the LDS was too warm and cuddly for his taste, so he started his own crackpot cult and chose to support them through food stamp fraud. He started a cult calling itself the Fundamentalist Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, or FLDS for short. Although the Mormons have renounced their long-standing white supremacist declarations, publicly at least, Warren Jeffs decided his brand of Mormonism would be based on precisely that. The Southern Poverty Law Center identifies the FLDS as a group of white supremacists, so it's not just Professor Truth saying it. The FLDS are split between Colorado City, Arizona, and Hilldale, Utah, and they refer to their two enclaves collectively as Short Creek, though given their behavior, Short Bus would have been a better name. Polygamy is rampant, but education is not. According to prosecutors, the FLDS cult has wholesale taken over the host towns where they set up shop and made all of the non-cult community members unwelcome in what were previously their homes. The FLDS cult has been accused of using all manner of tactics to persecute non-cult residents, and it's straight out of the white supremacist handbook, depriving them of housing, water services, and police protection. Sounds like San Francisco, Flint, and New York to me. Anyway, Jeffs called himself a prophet, though the only doctrine he seemed to be practicing was be fruitful and multiply, because he has dozens of wives, so many in fact no one knows for sure how many. The Washington Post says 60, Rolling Stones magazine said 80. Either way, they all agree the guy has over 60 children. Now, as we all know, the white supremacists love to talk about black people having tons of out-of-wedlock births and then using public assistance money for fun and toys. But here, you have one white man alone who has fathered over 5 dozen bastard children with his harem of half-wives and subsidizes his pimp-in-the-desert lifestyle at taxpayer expense. And this doesn't bother white people one iota. Well, Warren Jeffs got himself a life sentence 5 years ago for child rape. One of his victims was 15 when he got her pregnant, the other only 12 when he raped her. And this white supremacist mistreatment of children didn't stop there. Last year, the FLDS was sued by the Labor Department after they were accused of making at least 175 children younger than age 13 work as farm laborers without compensation. Since then, one of Warren's brothers has been managing the family scam, church, while he's been in the hoosgal. But the authorities have arranged for a family reunion, because the cops arrested both Lyle Jeffs and Seth Jeffs, along with 9 other cult leaders, on fraud and money laundering charges. According to the authorities, 700 Short Creek households received a total of $7.2 million in food stamp recipients' benefits last year alone. To put that in perspective for you, that breaks down to about $10,000 a year per household in food stamps. $10,000 a year in food. That's over $800 a month per household. I guess cranking out the prophet's bastard babies works up an appetite. The prophet was taking the food stamps from the beneficiaries and using the funds to pay his cult's operating expenses. They set up a couple of so-called convenience stores as clumsy fronts for their fraud. The cultists would come in and allow the stores to withdraw money off their snap cards, and the cult leaders used the money to buy things for their operation, like tractors. And this doesn't even cover other earlier food stamp fraud rings like Operation Manatee in Florida back in 2013, in which 103 people, mostly white, were arrested in a massive fraud operation. These are the types of stories the white media isn't covering and isn't going to, not because they don't exist and not because they aren't newsworthy, but because the point of the white media isn't to inform the public, it's to indoctrinate them. So they lie and lie big, and conceal anything that doesn't fit their narrative. You hear food stamp fraud, and they try to show you a single mother who hustled a couple of dollars for a designer handbag. Just keep these stories in mind. Unless it involves a business, it's not food stamp fraud, it's petty theft. Now you know the difference.